and welcome to Oncology Special Edition. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dr. Miguel-Angel Perales, co-chair of CAR-T Vision and past president, American Society for Transplantation and Cellular Therapies. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Miguel.
Thank you very much for having me today.
In this session, we will dive into the innovative clinical research surrounding the CAR-T cell therapy that bring new hope for patients facing the aggressive and hard-to-treat cancers. We will also look at the barriers and that still limit to access for many patients. And we are looking for the goal double to access to this life-saving therapy by the 2030. As one of the leading experts in cellular therapy, could you start by giving us a general overview of the current landscape of the CAR-T cell therapy, the treatment options, clinical impact to date, and your vision for how it will evolve in the years ahead?
Sure. So obviously, CAR-T cell therapies really represent a paradigm shift in the treatment of patients with oncology, particularly currently with patients with hematologic malignancies. So CAR-T cells, have been studied now for well over a decade, and the first approvals came in 2016, 2017, initially in patients with acute leukemia, as well as lymphoma. And more recently, we've seen additional approvals in multiple myeloma, as well as different indications in lymphoma. And the way the CAR-T cells work today is we're talking really about autologous products, meaning that the patient provides the cell for their own treatment. So it's a multi-step process where we collect the cells from the patient, then they're sent to the company that manufactures the cells. They insert the gene to make the CAR-T cell. And in a process that takes about 3 or 4 weeks, depending on the product, we receive the cells back and ready for infusion. Typically, during that time, the patient gets additional therapy, what we call bridging therapy. And the goals of bridging therapy are to, number one, at least try and control the disease while the patient is waiting for the cells to be manufactured. And in some cases, actually decrease the disease burden. And we have a lot of data emerging showing that patients treated with less disease do better with less toxicity, as well as better efficacy. And then once we have the cells, the patient receives lymphodepletion, which is a 3-day chemotherapy, typically a combination of fludarabine and cyclophosphamide, and the cells get infused. And then the critical phase is the next 3 to 4 weeks, where we need to monitor the patients closely for specific side effects of CAR-T cells. And really what we're talking about here is the cytokine release syndrome, or CRS, which is a hyperinflammatory response, as well as neurological toxicity that we also call ICANS. There are also additional longer-term potential side effects of CAR-T cells, but really that 28-day windows is where we monitor these patients closely. So where have we seen benefits of these treatments? I think we have enough data now, certainly in patients with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, where we have enough follow-up from patients treated on clinical trials, as well as in the real world, that we can say that a number of patients are actually cured with CAR-T cells. So remember, these are patients who have disease that is relapsed and refractory to standard chemotherapy, for whom there are really no good treatment options. And we're able to effectively treat these patients and induce long-term remissions. And as I said, and certainly based on the long-term follow-up beyond 5 years, and in some cases, we can speak of a cure. And that's certainly the case for lymphoma. I think we also have similar data, particularly in pediatric ALL, which was the first approval for CAR-T cells. And then in myeloma, where there's currently 2 products approved, I think we certainly see a prolonged remission duration. The question is whether a fraction of those patients actually have long-term responses and may be cured. I think right now in myeloma, we're still trying to understand that data and see if the patients are in fact being cured. But I think there is no doubt in my mind that this is a paradigm shift that provides a benefit to patients who have other treatment options.
And the reports highlighted that only about 20-30% of the eligible patients currently receive the CAR T-cell therapy. From the clinical perspective, what are the most significant barriers you have observed in the practice that prevent timely access to CAR T-cell therapy?
Yes, and so that really speaks to this effort, this vision for CAR T-cells that we have developed. And we've identified really 3 areas to focus on, which is number 1, increase awareness around CAR T-cells, and that's a multi-level awareness, the referring physicians, the patients, but also policymakers and payers. Number 2, expand resources to better deliver CAR T-cells, and especially to deliver CAR T-cells closer to where the patients are. And finally, we have to develop sustainable financial models that ensure that the treatments are actually reimbursed. So I think that really speaks to the areas that we've identified as being barriers to CAR T-cells being available to patients. And when you think about it, you have to think about it, very much. There are differences between countries, but also differences within a country like the US. And so some of the barriers that I see for my patients may be different from barriers in other states. So, for example, the issues that we see here in New York is many patients who would be eligible for CAR T-cells are simply not referred for treatment. And I think there may be some misperceptions by the local oncologists who think that the barriers to CAR T-cells, and particularly the patient's fitness, may be higher than they actually are. I mean, we have treated patients in their 80s with CAR T-cells, and I think there is still this myth among some local oncologists who are mostly seeing patients with solid tumor, and then may see a patient with lymphoma and think, well, if you're over 60, you can't get CAR T-cells. And that's simply not true. There are also barriers from a patient perspective. In some cases, the patients live far away, and they need to have that sort of caregiver for 28 days. And so typically the patient's in the hospital for 1 week to 2 weeks, recovering from the treatment and from the side effects. But the current requirement is that the patient be close to the center for 28 days. And from some patients, that's a major barrier because they don't have a caregiver, or their potential caregivers, have other responsibilities. They may be caring for children. They may have a job that if they don't work, they don't get paid. And so that's one of the major barriers too. I had a patient a few years ago from Western Pennsylvania who had, relapsed refractory lymphoma, was referred to see me for CAR T-cells. We did a telemedicine visit. I explained the process, and the patient said, I'm very sorry, doctor, I just can't do this. I mean, he was apologizing to me. And I said, well, what was the problem? He said, well, I don't have a caregiver. I can't impose on my family to take that time off and relocate to New York City. And so I said, you realize that this is probably the only treatment that can cure you. And he said, I understand, but I just don't have the option. And so I actually offered to send the patient to Philadelphia. I thought, well, he's in Pennsylvania, maybe Philadelphia's closer, and this treatment can just as well be given at Penn as in New York at MSK. I mean, it's the same treatments that we're giving. And he said, no, even Philadelphia was too far. So I think that really illustrates the problem at the patient level. And we actually just have a publication that came out in Blood Advances where we looked at SEER data, so National Cancer Registry data. And there's a clear, I would say, discrimination by zip code. And so patients, the way we studied this is we looked at patients where they were diagnosed by zip code and where the CAR T center was by zip code. And patients whose zip code is closer to CAR T center are more likely to get treated with CAR T cells than patients who have a zip code far away from a CAR T center. So there are big differences regionally. There are actually some states in the US where there's no CAR T program. And they have to go out of state, and that also then, creates other barriers in terms of insurance and Medicare, for example, paying across state lines. So I think those are multiple issues that we've identified. We need to try and bring more awareness to the physicians and patients. Have more centers providing CAR T-cell who are closer to the patients. We need to try and reduce the time that it takes for patients to be at the CAR T center. We have data now that we've presented at meetings showing that, most of the side effects, at least in lymphoma, happen during the first 14 days. And side effects, either have resolved by day 14, or if the patient hasn't had any side effects, it's not going to happen after 14 days. So in the few patients who still have side effects at day 14, those patients obviously would keep. But probably more than 90% of the patients, the side effects haven't happened or they've already resolved. And it would probably be safe to let them go home, under close guidance, obviously, but not be local. And I think even that a difference would be significant in terms of the burden on patients and the need to have a caregiver. So I think that could have a big impact if we can make those changes. And finally, I think we also have to look at sustainable reimbursement models, because clearly, in some cases, insurance can still be a significant barrier, or some of the out-of-pocket costs for the patients can be significant. So we have to be able to address those as well, and the overall cost of the treatment.
You have closely involved in efforts to address this challenge. Could you elaborate on specific initiatives or models of care delivery that have shown promise in reducing these barriers?
So I think there's multiple examples now where we can try and reduce these barriers. At our center, we're very interested in trying to shorten the period of time that the patients have to be seen locally. And so that's why we studied our own data looking at resolution of side effects, and we're thinking about pilot project to assess whether we can have patients go home, for example, in Long Island, and be followed by local physicians who are part of our network who see patients out in Long Island. I mean, that would be one strategy to make CAR T cells more accessible. I think there's another model which is very interesting, which has been developed by the University of Pennsylvania. They're a big CAR T program based in Philadelphia, but they've partnered with two other hospitals, one that's local to Philadelphia, but targets patients who are Jehovah's Witnesses, and so who cannot take transfusions. And so that's a particular patient population that is seen at one of the hospitals in Philadelphia. And so Penn has partnered with that hospital to treat patients there. And then another hospital, which is, I think, about 3 hours away from Philadelphia, and where they've essentially trained the local physicians and established a program which is now 3 hours away from Philadelphia, but still under the oversight of the Penn team. And so I think that's one model where you have sort of a hub and spoke approach where a central program within a network can also open up the CAR T programs at other hospitals, regional hospitals that within their network. So I think we have to think about different solutions in different areas. I don't think it's going to be one size fits all. And I think we also have to think about, some of the bigger oncology practices, which are community-based. How can we have them deliver CAR T cells? What are the barriers for them in terms of accreditation, in terms of training, in terms of, the ICU support and so forth, as well as the reimbursement models. So I think we have to think on a broad scale at different models for different areas and different solutions.
In the effort to double the number of the patients treated with the CAR T by 2030, what role do you see for the community-based treatment centers in expanding the access while keeping safety and effectiveness?
I mean, I think one of the challenges we have is, we're saying that basically the data shows that 20% of patients eligible for CAR T cells are actually getting CAR T cells today in the US. And we want to double that to 40%. And you could say, well, 40% is still not enough, right? It should be 100%. But we realize that, if we say 100%, it's unachievable. So even doubling, I think, would be progress. But we have to sort of figure out how to do that. And I think one of the ways we're going to have to do that is develop more CAR T programs in the community. I think that's, the distance from the CAR T center, from the current CAR T centers, is a major barrier. And so I gave you a couple of examples of that. But I think it's going to have to be part of the solution. We have to, figure out a way to be able to deliver CAR T cells closer to the patients, and whether that's the patients going home sooner, or whether that's building programs in hospitals that are affiliated with the CAR T program, or whether it's just developing new CAR T programs in large community practices. I think we have to think of all of those solutions, and as I said, different states and different areas of the country will need different solutions to work locally. But we have to be creative, because I think, as a physician who's been in this field now, for a couple of decades in transplant and cell therapy, it's unacceptable to me that we have treatments that are highly effective, that can actually cure patients today, and that 20 to 30% of patients are only getting access to those treatments. I mean, it's almost a scandal that the other 70% of patients don't even get the treatment.
A key goal is to improve awareness and speed up the referrals. How can we better educate healthcare providers to refer eligible patients for CAR T cell therapy sooner?
I mean, I think, if you think about it, CAR T cells have been available now commercially for, it's going to be a decade in just a year or so. And so that means we're training now, a new generation of hematologists and oncologists who at least have some experience with CAR T cells. I mean, they may not necessarily treat patients with CAR T cells, but at least they have more awareness about the treatment. And so I am hopeful that as we have more of these physicians that we're training going out into the community, that they'll be more likely to refer patients for CAR T cell treatment. But I think we also need to do a better job ourselves of educating physicians and patients about what the opportunity represents for CAR T cells for our patients, and actually for their patients, right? Because they're the ones who are seeing the patients at diagnosis, and then who will be following the patients after CAR T cells. We're just there for a procedure.
As CAR T cell therapies become more accessible, what are the most critical considerations for the treatment centers to optimize patient experience and outcomes during the entire treatment journey?
I think we've learned a lot about CAR T cells, and particularly about how to best manage the toxicities. We've learned a lot about how we can decrease the risk of toxicities and select patients better. One of the anecdotes I like to share is one of our ICU doctors is a very well-known expert in the management of CAR T cell patients in the ICU. And a couple of years ago, she said to me, Miguel, I have a problem because you're not sending enough patients with CAR T cells to the ICU with complications. And so I'm not able to train the ICU doctors, the fellows, on how to manage CAR T cells. And I said, listen, that's a good thing. That means that we're doing a better job. And so I think our own experience at our center, but also the data that comes out of the registry, as well as real-world data, shows that the incidence and the grading of toxicity has decreased over time with the same product. So that means that there is better patient selection, but also that we're bridging better, so patients are going in with less a burden of disease to CAR T cells, and therefore have less toxicity, because we know that disease bulk predicts as one of the predictors of toxicity. We have mitigation strategies, for example, use of corticosteroids prophylactically or preemptively, which have changed from when we first started. And then there are other strategies at our center. We've published data targeting the IL-1 pathway with anakinra, showing that that can be used to decrease the incidence of toxicity as well. So I think overall, we've been able to make CAR T cells safer. And so I think that is a critical development. And I think that, again, allows us to move more patients getting CAR T cells to the outpatient setting, but also to think about, treating these patients in community settings, given the lower levels of toxicity that are commonly seen now compared to when we first started. So I think that's going to be a big development. I think, if we're successful, and I really, hope that we are, and we increase the number of CAR T patients being treated with CAR T cells, obviously we'll need to make sure that there's enough capacity in the system. And that's only going to happen if we build more centers. At some point, there's going to be limitations of capacity at the current centers. And, we've expanded from initial diagnosis of large B-cell lymphoma and ALL to mantle cell lymphoma, follicular lymphoma, CLL, multiple myeloma, and so forth. There's a lot of work going on in solid tumor to develop effective cellular therapies. We already have approval of TILs. Now, these are not engineered cells, but they're also given typically in cell therapy units. But there may be eventually successful treatments with engineered T cells, whether it's CAR Ts or TCRs for solid tumor. And obviously, there are many more patients with solid tumor than hematologic malignancies. So you could imagine the impact on capacity if we have a successful therapy in patients with solid tumor. We have to anticipate that. And then there's a whole other area that's not even in malignancy. There's some very exciting data emerging in patients with autoimmune disease. And you could imagine if those things, those treatments work in patients with lupus or scleroderma, myasthenia gravis. There's been some early publications in those diseases that we could see a significant increase in the number of patients being treated. And that means training a whole other group of physicians to deliver these cells. And again, a significant expansion in capacity to be able to treat these patients. So I think we're just at the dawn of a new era when it comes to CAR T cells. I think we need to do much better in terms of giving access to the patients who should be getting CAR T cells today. But we also have to think of the future and how we build for the future.
And from global perspective, what the policy or regulatory innovation do you believe are most urgent needed to ensure equitable access to CAR T cell therapies across the different healthcare systems?
So this is obviously a huge question also in the field. So we now have CAR T cells approved in various countries. The current focus of the CAR T vision has really been on the US and the EU. Even between the US and the EU, there are significant differences in terms of healthcare systems. In the EU, the CAR T cells, the treatments are approved at the European level by the EMA, but then each individual country then decides on pricing considerations and approval, within the healthcare system of that country. But obviously, these therapies are expensive, not just the cost of the CAR T cells, but also the cost of managing the patient and delivering the care. And so we have to think about models that may work in other countries. There's expansion of CAR T cells in Latin America, Mexico, in Asia, and many countries don't have the types of resources that we have in the US or in Western Europe. And so I think we have to think of models where we can democratize access to CAR T cells and make sure that patients in those countries as well get access to these life-saving treatments. And so I think we're going to have to be creative in terms of the cost of the therapy, and there may be different models that work in different countries. In India, for example, we're seeing development of point-of-care CAR T cells, where the center manufactures the product directly for the patient. There is significant less cost in that model. There's also less regulatory oversight. A company making CAR T cells has much more regulatory barriers that they need to address versus a single hospital making it for patients. And so I think different models may work in different countries or different parts of the world.
Looking ahead to the future of the CAR T cell therapies, what excites you most about the future of the CAR T cell therapy and the other cellular treatments?
I think this has been, a very exciting field to be part of. I mean, I've really, learned a lot over the last decade of being part of this field. I think what has been, really a unique experience is to see how effective these treatments can be. I had a patient, this is now several years ago, who we treated, who had a lesion in his neck, which was about the size of a peach. So you could literally walk in the room and he couldn't even hold his head straight because of this large mass. So he was always turned. And, by day 28, this thing had disappeared. And, we did a PET scan, but I didn't even need a PET scan to see that he'd had a complete response. I mean, the patient could tell just looking in the mirror and feeling the back of his neck. So this is a treatment that has, provided significant benefit, and that continues to be something that, is exciting as a doctor taking care of these patients, to see patients that we can treat effectively, safely, and that can provide long-term remissions, potentially a cure. I think that's something that continues to excite me. I think, as we develop CAR T cells, obviously we started with patients after several lines of therapy, and now in lymphoma, we're treating patients in second line and seeing potentially better results. Phase 3 data showing differences in overall survival versus the original standard of care. So I think we're seeing progress there. There's a lot of new CAR T cells being developed that may be more effective and safer for the patients that we're treating today. So I'm hoping that we'll see further improvements and a higher percent of patients being cured, the ones that we're treating today. And then we talked about, obviously the future is also, patients with solid tumor and patients with other diseases, autoimmune diseases. So I think we're going to see tremendous growth in the next few years in this field.
Thank you very much. Well, I have finished all my questions. I don't know, is there anything else would you like to add or highlight from this discussion?
I think the one point I would re-emphasize is that these treatments have now been FDA approved since 2016, 2017, and to me it's unacceptable as a physician taking care of these patients that so few patients are actually being able to be treated with these treatments. So I think I really feel a sense of urgency that we need to do better. And I would actually argue that doubling the number of patients by 2030 is not enough. And we have to do more than that. We really should try to provide this treatment to every patient who is eligible, and so that we can cure more patients.
Thank you very much for joining us today and for all this information you share with us.
Thank you.